always been in the space between the person with an idea and reality. I really appreciate having someone else's enthusiasm for something to feed off as sort of a vampire, benevolent vampire. Let me tell you what I've been doing just today so you'll have a context for my occasional like chest clutch. Crazy Friday over here. Needing to reprice all of our ebooks at the drop of a hat and getting one of our kids' books called out in the Wall Street Journal. Total surprise. So I thought I was going to have a quiet Friday, and in fact, I've been in a frenetic state ever since I got in. But you know, this is nice. This is a break.
So what happens when you get a when you get a mention like that? Do you straight away see the effect of it on your end?
Oh yeah, very often. I mean, knock on wood. And of course, we seek to broadcast it in the metadata in all of the text that accompanies the book out onto all the digital retail sites as fast as possible. So that's the fire drill we've been having, is just to get that all set up so that people shopping Amazon, Barnes, and everywhere else can see it tomorrow when the print review comes out. So yeah, that sort of
Wow,
thing.
that's fantastic. Wonderful. Congrats.
Thank you.
At times like this, do you take the weekend off, or are you working through the weekend?
I very much take weekends off. Yes, yes.
I did I did read somewhere, or someone might have told me at some point that during the summers, publishers take Fridays off as well. Is that still a thing, or am I misremembering?
Fridays. It's a it is not a consistent practice. It is absolutely a tradition. I have heard of workplaces that offer a certain number of freebie Fridays in the summer, workplaces that close early every Friday, workplaces that close every Friday. It depends on the publisher. So it's, you know, it is not a, it's, you get the perks package you so happen to get depending on where you are. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, okay, yeah, wonderful.
Yeah. It's so funny. It's, our lead publisher refers to it as fairy dust when media attention surprises you out of the blue for a title you may not have expected because it's a few years old or just not the one you were betting on as your, you know, lead horse, so to speak. So fairy dust Friday.
Tell me about it. It's funny how that happens sometimes. Yeah, like you, at least speaking from my experience, like you'll plan something and you'll want it to work out, and then no matter what I do, it doesn't work out. And this other thing that I wasn't paying much attention to somehow picks up, and then you give it attention.
Right.
Um, and then many years later, you want to look back and construct a narrative about how you knew all along that that was going to work out. But really, at the time, yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, hard to predict these things.
We're very much in the business of guessing, signing up at the books for any given season. Of course, we always think they're all going to succeed, but we know historically that some will receive the fairy dust, and we don't know which ones those will be.
So you majored in physics, I saw, and then you ended up in publishing.
Yes, weird. I better not overclaim. So I went to Columbia, so I concentrated in physics. It's a little bit smaller than a major, but they let me out with a diploma, so that was a relief. I taught myself web design in the era, and I guess our era. This was just something you did if you were a sciencey kid in college, I imagine. I didn't completely know what I wanted to do after college, and I was applying to jobs I thought I could do. So actually, I became pre-certified to teach high school physics in New Jersey, and I applied to publishing jobs. And I got a publishing job with that digital publisher I mentioned before on the basis of my coding skills, not that just like straight HTML and CSS is really coding, because ebooks are made of exactly the same stuff as websites. And from there became a general assistant here at the Experiment, where actually we do publish some sciencey titles. And from there have grown my career entirely here at the Experiment. So that's how that happened. I'm not sure I could speak to why that happened, but I'm sticky. I like it here. So
I personally love it when I look at someone's profile and I see that they were one place and they ended up somewhere else, because it usually means they were curious about the world outside of the lab or the immediate thing that they were trained in or that they decided to major in college. Because when I think back to college for me, I don't know that I really gave it much thought. It just, I picked a field of study and I went into it, and I didn't look at what else was out there. And sometimes you do that in college, sometimes you do it afterwards. And so long as you end up somewhere where you feel you have a purpose and you're doing work that's fulfilling, I think that's the key thing.
We have, I promise not to market many of our books on this call, but we have a book called The Renaissance Soul. And certainly it spoke to me. It's a self-help book for people with just like multiple interests who sometimes get labeled like jack of all trades, master of none, like in sort of a derogatory way, but who are, of course, as the title suggests, the Renaissance men and women. The author's Margaret Lopenstein, one of her solutions for having this nature is to find a job where you get to sample different subjects or types of responsibility in the course of the same job. And so I think book publishing is actually one of the ones she cites, because even though the process of producing every book may be simpler, the content of it is always going to be different to the next book, to the next book, to the next book. So you can not feel that restlessness of, oh, I have to do the same thing every day, because every book is so different from the next book. So a recommended job for Renaissance souls, I'm realizing I don't mean to make myself sound lofty, but but you see what I'm getting at.
I love it. So 2 points. One on the generalist point that you mentioned. I think it's going to be more relevant than it was before, especially in the world I'm in. I know maybe a lot of people are sick of hearing AI, but one thing that I thought was relevant and true is this talk that all these tools are going to turn people into generalists to some extent.
That's interesting.
Because they don't need to learn specific languages anymore. They just need to have a vision, and then these tools will help you implement that vision, and then you can move on to the next thing. Have an idea and a vision there, then implement it there. Now, obviously, there's a trade-off because you can't debug things as you could before.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know if the machine is giving you something that's actually good quality or future-proofed or not. But yeah, I like the idea of a generalist in this world. I feel like they're able to contribute a lot. And then the other thing you mentioned about the publishing process and how it can help someone not get bored. I definitely see that because yeah, it's like a new baby every time.
It never for me gets old. We get that first box of books from the printer, the advances, and of course there's some danger they're all upside down, as you yourself have experienced on occasion.
That was a weird one. Did you ever get to the bottom of it?
Well, yes and no. I have gotten to visit a bindery once, which is great fun. And the covers, at least at this bindery, at the machine that I observed, were being loaded into a certain machine by hand in batches that were not that big. So it's very possible for by one mistake, the person loading the batches puts one batch of covers in upside down relative to the pages, and then they go on those books upside down. But the thing is, it's such a localized error. It doesn't mean that there was like a quality control issue with a whole run, although of course clearly there was a quality control issue because this error was made. But it's only ever going to affect that batch. If you don't know that, if you like haven't seen it in action, you can say, how did they ever get this crazy book totally upside down? But it actually is sort of it's not a one-off because it'll be a batch, but it'll be a little batch. So it's not the only book I've seen it happen to. It's just painful when it's the first box.
No, it's all good. So for context, this was the last book that came out a few years ago, and then I think it was a day or two maybe after it came out, some people started posting online asking why is my book upside down, and I was thinking of you, honestly. I'm thinking how does one fix that? Do you go in and you look at the books one by one? But we told people to reach out and we'll make it right. But I've seen it happen other ways. I've seen books that are where the cover is messed up or the colors aren't right, and that will be the first review that they post on Amazon, for instance. And it hurts because, like you said, you've put 9 months or a year into this whole production process, and then all of a sudden, something that feels like it's maybe out of your hands affects that first impression that a reader has.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, it's true. It's easy to forget too easy to forget what a manual process it is. And it was very interesting at the bindery. I don't mean to suggest that they were doing badly or that there's a lot of waste. I'm sure that these were pulped and recycled, but it was interesting to see the bins of like, well, that one's crooked, oh, that one's upside down, into the bins with those because it's a manual production process. The machinery they were running on, I think, was like some of it was like 80 years old because bookbinding hasn't changed that much.
I'm sure there are these museums in New York. Here in San Francisco, there's a small museum called, I think, American Bookbinding Museum, something like that. And I've been to it, and it's so interesting. You see how all the machines haven't evolved all that much. I mean, what we have today are kind of look like what we had two, three
Books
hundred years ago. Yeah,
have been very similar in form for a very long time.
that's true. Yeah.
We don't have to cut the pages open anymore with a knife, as
Oh, is
was
that the case?
they were still folded at the. I don't know if it was every book, but I know that there was an era where the pages were still folded together at the turnable side, and you had to split them if you were reading the book for the first time.
Well, yeah, I would definitely. I've done it. I've gone to a workshop where I've learned how to bind books. I can't claim to be an expert. I only did it the one time, but it is a very therapeutic experience, and I would, yeah,
You get out your
definitely do it again. Yeah.
right.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I'd never sewn anything before in my life. It was my first time doing that. But I think just the fact that it's a manual process and there are so many things that you have to do to end up with this thing that looks that you're used to. You don't give it much thought when you see a book somewhere, but a lot of craft goes into it.
Oh, for sure. It's funny. They. I was a great reader as a kid, and I used to write books, and I used to stick them together with paper fasteners when I was very young. So I still have some of my old books that I wrote and illustrated in crayon stuck together with paper fasteners. But then when I was in middle school, and I hope my grade school best friend will forgive me for relating the story. She wrote it like a novella in middle school, set in, I think, medieval Ireland. And I was so taken with her novella that I put it into Word. And not knowing about booklet printing, I devised a system of getting it into booklet printed order. And then I
Wow.
printed it out in groups, sewed it together, and bound it. And in retrospect, I was like, oh, so maybe I really am sort of a cradle publisher. He wrote the book, but I published it. I drew I drew the two main characters for the end papers and used a printout of my own art as the as part of the binding on the end papers there. I hope she still has that. One of a kind. Very limited edition.
Just the one, yeah, one edition. um, I noticed that I think it was a few years into my learning about the industry that there is still a lot of reliance on acquisition editors and what they think might work in the market and their connections and that sort of thing. Is that still the case, or is there any kind of move towards something that's more? Um, is there a reliance on machines at all to predict some of these things, or have people tried them?
What a fantastic question. What I really know hands on is how a small indie press like us works. Acquisitions editors are pretty common. They play a huge role at big publishers. So these, for the perhaps uninitiated, would be editors who are looking for books to acquire, but not necessarily spending the time to line edit those books once the publisher has them on the list. It would get handed off to sort of a content editor. We are not big enough to be that segmented. Very often it's the editor who spotted something here, the experiment editor who got pitched it, who edits it, content edits it, and sometimes Matthew sees something good and says this would be right for you, and then the next thing the project lands in your lap. So sometimes our publisher is sort of our acquisitions editor here. To your question about machines, I have a strong sense that other bigger houses have trend watching machines who see what keyword searches are being done and that they are using that as a jumping off point to say, well, this seems like a book that should exist because it's a keyword search that's not producing any books for people to buy. That's an educated guess. We don't have that. We don't have that here. But we see the competitors that rise up alongside our books in the different categories we publish in.
So in your case, then, um, are you creating risk profiles of books and then hedging that way, or are you going after things that you feel are original or creative and then hoping that they do well? Because there must be, I mean, you must be focused on the financial side of things as well. Otherwise, I mean, it's hard to survive in the industry. Yeah.
It's a great question. We have a little spreadsheet, everybody does, I think, where we run the numbers on what will it cost to print this, what will it cost to pay the author their advance, how much do we think we're going to spend on publicity, and so on. Do we think we can sell rights to a foreign publisher who might want to translate it, or to an audio publisher who might want to record it? So we take a best guess at the likely income from the project, and then we say, okay, how many copies would this need to sell so we're at least breaking even? And it's one of the educated metrics we apply to the projects we're considering. We're a little publisher with a big distributor, which is a whole other thing we can get into.
I wanted to ask about that. Yeah, how does that change
Right.
change things when you have a huge distributor?
Right. But before I do, one of the things I wanted to sort of say is that we're not totally ruthless about is every title going to be a sure hit. We do consider things holistically. We look at what we like personally. We look at what seems to be succeeding in the market. If we get a proposal from an author and they seem to have an established following, we can't help but take that into account. But occasionally, we will take a flyer on something. We will take a risk on something we haven't seen before if we think it's a gamble that makes sense in the moment. Like, we sort of have the flexibility to do that. I don't know if it's necessarily correlated to being, a more, what's the right word? A smaller operation. We're not Random House. That we can be a little bit more streamlined and flexible in a way that startups often are. Even your book, even your first book, I would say it was by no means a gamble because there was clearly internet appetite for the self-published edition, which won us all over, pretty much immediately. But there was an interesting aspect to it. And I just thought, I realized I never maybe talked to you about this before, that when you said creative, do you look for creative or original projects? We absolutely do. But sometimes they do provide an interesting challenge because they don't have an obvious home in a bookstore. So in the digital marketplace, that's one thing. But in a bookstore, it's like, okay, does it go in creative writing? Does it go with like the internet culture books? Does it go with philosophy? Does it go with mathematical logic? Is it cartoons? I have it here. Obviously, you don't need me to show you your own book, but I have seen this like 5 different places in a bookstore. And sometimes a project that defies genre a little bit can pose a challenge to our sales reps and can pose a challenge to our retail partners. And I dare say you might not see every publisher knowing what to do with this. I'm not by any means saying we're totally unique, but there is something to the original projects that they can cut both ways. It can be like, oh great, I've never seen this before, and it can be like, no, where does this go? I love the original projects.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, sometimes that's the issue is not the content. The issue is how do you classify it? Mm-hmm. And if you're used to classifying things into one of 10 buckets, and all of a sudden there's this one that doesn't quite fit into any of those, maybe that becomes an issue.
And the store is built around the buckets, and the readers are used to shopping within the buckets, as it were, so to speak. Yeah. Which is the way I think the digital marketplace has really actually shaken up, what can work and what can find its audience.
Fantastic. I wanted to go back to you mentioned we were talking about acquisitions editors. Actually, I've not gotten to my questions yet. I'm just kind of riffing off what we were talking about originally. I always enjoy talking with you. We mentioned acquisitions editors. I just wanted to maybe clarify the whole process. So we said there's a manuscript that an author would submit it then. An acquisitions editor would potentially acquire it for the house. And then there's a sales team, there are other teams involved. And then there's a bit of a process or a lead time from the time a a manuscript gets acquired to the time a book appears in the market. Do you mind just briefly going over that process? What does that entail? What are all the moving parts? Because I don't know that everybody realizes how big of an effort it is to take something on in a proposal form to a finished product.
Sometimes we get a full manuscript. Other times we get a proposal. So it will be, here are some chapter summaries, here's an example chapter, here's broadly what I'm planning to do, and so on. Work out the contract with the author, sign it, and then depending on the state of the project, the first step may be that they go off and finish writing it. The manuscript, that will then flow from the author to the editor, maybe back and forth a few times, maybe in parts if it's better for the process. But somewhat simultaneously, we have our publicity and marketing team making a plan for the title. We have our data team setting up our central database with the cover and the copy and the price and the size and the weight and everything that retailers need to know so that pre-order pages go up, both on the reader-facing sites that you shop yourself and in the internal systems that wholesalers and bookstores use to pre-order our books, so they have them ready on the shelves when they eventually come out and are new. So parallel tracks here. But back to the manuscript, once the editor and author are happy with it, very often it'll go past a copy editor, so they'll be reading less for content, more for punctuation, spelling, oversights, maybe a bit of late fact-checking, depending. Design team will have already produced very likely a sample layout for the pages. Then they'll receive the approved text. Finally, they'll do a layout that will get bounced back and forth to our internal reviewers or sometimes to also a proofreader. So this thing gets read so many times. Off to the printer and back from the printer. And in some of these stages where we have the basically final interior as PDF, but we don't have the print books yet. That's when here the publicity team really kicks in, because now they have something to share with potential media reviewers. Sales reps have more to share to accounts who hopefully have already pre-ordered this book, but it kind of revives the second big sort of push there, I think it's fair to say. We get early copies of the book, send some out to people who we hope will say something nice about it or feature it. And then the rest of those copies take a slightly slower track to our warehouse. From there to the accounts who have ordered it, and to the distribution centers of the major accounts who have a national presence. Onto bookshelves! And then it's a book. And I didn't even spare a thought for the poor ebook, which gets converted at that same stage where we have that final PDF. We produce that ebook. Whole other team sends that out everywhere. Gosh, it's a lot of work, isn't it? I don't do all of it.
It's a lot of work. The printer is often it's offshore, is that right? So it gets sent to overseas because it's more economical that way?
I will say often, not always. The pricing of any given book really depends on the special features thereof. If you're doing a lot of embossing, stamping, foiling, flaps, interesting folded pages, the production price tends to go up. The more the production price goes up, the more the better price tends to come from overseas. However, we do actually print in the US. We would say Asia, the Middle East, but also the US. Between them, our print jobs are shared. Also, we can get the books a lot faster if we print them here in the US.
Fantastic. And then maybe one last question about ebooks. I never thought that people would download ebooks or use or prefer them over print books.
Mm-hmm.
Are you seeing a healthy mix between the two? So are there people who only buy ebooks, do you find?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I'm equipped to tell you if there are people who only buy ebooks, because I have no way of knowing that the same person bought this, has bought that, has bought this, has bought that. But they do represent, I think, a reasonably steady percentage of total sales. Last I tuned into it was around 20%. I can't claim that this is a data point I follow assiduously, but they are definitely, you cannot neglect them. You want to be selling an ebook if you can make one. But nor does it seem to be creeping up and up, where it's eating away more and more print sales. My very impressionistic sense is that there's this group who prefers them, and that group keeps buying them in the same proportion. But I'm not over at Nielsen, who could really tell you.
I was going to say, yeah, they would know. Yeah, the thing I was curious about is if it was potentially cannibalizing print book sales. But if it's the case that it's at some steady number, then maybe there are people who have a preference for ebooks and they'll always buy ebooks. I don't know enough about it either.
I was actually in ebook production on the side for a while there. I'm a little bit more removed from it now. It's hard to look at them when you have the like beautiful print layout in your mind, because in the vast majority of cases they do not preserve that beautiful print layout. But I do think it's easy to forget they offer wonderful improvements in accessibility. And as my eyesight continues to require more and more intensive glasses, I'm like, actually, it could be really nice to just be able to stretch these words as big as I want them.
It doesn't work with paper, does it? Yeah.
Paper. Um, yeah, ebooks, they have their place. And I think they might also be easier. Like, I have this acute awareness of like, are all of our books making it into warehouses in Malaysia? Are all of our books making it out to warehouses in Europe? It's harder. The ebook just goes everywhere. Like, if we have world rights, anyone who goes online can order that ebook. And there's no obstacle except the occasional tech mistake. The other day I caught that one of our ebooks had been put out of stock. And I was like, don't think we've run out, but we check for that.
My daughter asked me about that a while back. She uses this app called Libby to download ebooks from the public library. And she tried to get an ebook and it was out of stock. And she's like, how can it be out of stock if it's an ebook? And then I thought, well, there must be some kind of arrangement with the publisher maybe where they have a quota of a few copies that are allowed to be on loan at any given time.
There are systems in place where an ebook will be available for so many checkouts during a period of time, or it will be available for so many checkouts before it has to be repurchased by the library. So with libraries in particular, I guess, yes, it is possible for them to be out of stock of an ebook. Very new to us.
Yeah.
We're old media. Very new way of doing things still.
So, Karen, I was looking at your LinkedIn page, but you've been in the industry for 15 years and you've done a whole bunch of things. One of your titles was positioning chief, I think it was.
It's true.
Let me make sure. I think I know what that's about, but I'd love to hear from you. What goes into your day to day as a positioning chief?
Oh, I think we crafted that title as a step up from copy chief. And so copy chief is what you would sort of expect. What do the books say? Especially like, what do they say in the back? So on. We in the industry talk about positioning as like trying to get the book into the right place in the market. So almost a little bit like what we were saying before, like what shelf does it go on? So the title, the subtitle, what the cover looks like, what the format is the vibe of the book going to get it in front of the reader who we think wants it the most? That's sort of the operating question of positioning. Those responsibilities, they don't fill every hour of my day by any means, but made me sort of a key player in meetings we would have around what does this book cover look like? What should the title and subtitle of this book be? Is it too similar or dissimilar to other books already existing in the genre or the category? That sort of discussion.
Yeah, that's what I figured. With positioning, it's like you said, it's the title, it's the subtitle, it's the cover. And then I love that you mentioned it's just the general vibe of the book. When you pick it up, do you know what it's about? I never realized how big an effect that has on a reader. With those decisions, are you primarily convincing the sales team internally?
We have a whole internal process that sort of focuses us in on the right direction. So among the experiment, our director of publicity marketing, our publisher, myself, our art director, production manager, and the editor of any given book we often try and hope to get to a place where we all agree on a direction and think it's the right direction. So from brainstorming title ideas, which often starts with the editor, through to a title, subtitle, and cover we all feel good about, usually takes place over a series of meetings and emails among that group. But then we have a couple interesting checkpoints, which is, of course, we need to hear what the author thinks once we have something we feel confident in presenting. And then our distributor. So the sales team, I'm going to give us a little sidebar here so I can explain the distributor thing and the sales team thing. Sidebar. Like a lot of small publishers, we don't have yet, wouldn't logistically be able to have right now, a warehouse, trucks, a national team of reps who reach out to local bookstores, major national chains, libraries, wholesalers, international regions, customer service reps who take orders, take returns, offer discounts. Blah. We don't have that. So that's why we have relationship with a distributor, which is a much bigger publisher who has all of those things in-house and then can offer all of those things as a service to a smaller publisher. So in our case, our current distributor is Norton. So the sales team is largely Norton. We have a couple of key experimenters who interface with them. So all this to say, once we like the cover, the author likes the cover, we still bounce it off our distributor, a sales conference. Sometimes we hit a home run and other times we slink away and go back to the drawing board, which is always an interesting perspective to get because at sales conference are the reps. The reps talk to the bookstores and sometimes we'll get feedback like, this whole category is yellow, the buyer is sick of yellow, the buyer does not want another yellow book cover in science memoir. Sorry, noted. And then we may find ourselves making some revisions. So that's kind of how that goes.
Gotcha. So you help writers like me get their books out into the world. I think when I started, I have mentioned this before in writing. I didn't think of myself as a writer, but then eventually you develop the confidence where you think, well, maybe this is something that I want to do more of, and it's in no small part thanks to editors and you in my case. Do you ever feel like you want to write, or do editors write books?
Editors write books. I've certainly seen editors who do. Yeah, word people. Somehow, even though I've written the occasional journal that takes the form of a story and so on, somehow for whatever reason it's not me. I've kind of always been, we're getting into talking about me as me, which probably isn't as interesting for your subscriber.
Go for it.
Somehow I've always been in the space between the person with an idea and reality. Like one of the early things I really loved to do, like in high school, was actually to be a stagehand and a backstage person, make the props and the scenery, build and plan, and try to get the person with the idea and the verve and the enthusiasm logistically through to a place where that was a reality. I'm kind of a logistics person. That's a weird term to apply to editing, but you see what I mean. I really appreciate having someone else's enthusiasm for something to feed off as sort of a vampire, benevolent vampire. Maybe someday I'll write.
I feel honestly, I don't want this to seem like too sentimental, but honestly, I think the writer couldn't do their job without the editor. I almost feel like the editor's job is, at least in my view, more important than the writer's, just because you say there's so much logistical work that goes into it. There's so many decisions about positioning. Maybe timing is a factor that the writer doesn't know about. Maybe they've written something that's good, but maybe not for the current market or for what's in vogue right now. And I feel like the combination of those two skill sets is essential. And sometimes one is in the spotlight, the other isn't, but I do feel they're both critical to the process.
I mean, they're absolutely both critical. In nonfiction, which is, again, the only form I've worked in, it's perhaps a little bit different than fiction in that sometimes our authors are always experts. sometimes they're experts in their subject matter without necessarily having a lot of aspirations to writing and being writers. Sometimes they're experts in their subject matter who really need a word person to get their expertise into book form. Perhaps slightly as opposed to fiction, where like they're word people, they want to write, they're story people, they want to write. Even in our case, on occasion, we've had a good idea for a book internally and said, well, who's the expert on this? Who hasn't written a book? Who could write this book? And we even, it's rare, but we find that person. We kind of make the book happen. It depends. The balance depends on the project. The role of the editor depends on the project. But of course, that second pair of eyes, especially when someone is so expert that certain aspects of their topic are obvious to them,
That's
that
true.
second pair of eyes who's not an expert in it can be pretty invaluable. Plus, we fix all your commas, you know. On occasion, I'm thinking more about maybe the role of the overall publisher instead of just the role of the editor. It can be entirely one thing to be writing a book, but then the publisher is who brings the knowledge of, oh, I'm constantly paying attention to the market. What's trending, what's not trending, what exists already, what doesn't exist already. Your book sounds great, but how is it different from this other book that's already an established bestseller? How can we make it different from this other book so that people buy both and we're not going head to head? That sort of thing. So getting the book into its context, and I guess now we're just talking about positioning again, but you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about nostalgia the other day and how the effects that it has on us later in life.
Mm.
So with video games, for instance, if you played video games as a kid, you might play them later in life because you remember how fun it was to be with your friends or family and play games. Similarly with books, when you read books as a middle schooler, and maybe as you grow older, then you also want to read books because it reminds you of a good period in your life.
You reread books.
Or you reread books, yeah, in some cases. Do you think it's important for us to double down on targeting young readers, so kids with books, especially in a time where their attention has shifted to a great extent to TikTok, social media, online? So do we need to do a better job of making sure that kids are still reading books?
This is the easiest question ever.
Yes.
Absolutely. It's vitally important. Of course. Of course, of course. As an older millennial, it's interesting. I can't remember if one of my friends was talking to me or if I was reading an article making the point that we're sometimes described as digital natives, but actually we're not. Younger millennials are. I learned cursive penmanship from Catholic nuns with a pencil. Ebooks did not exist when I was learning to read. I learned to read from the printed page. We did not have a computer in my home until I was in sixth grade. I did not start using a computer routinely for schoolwork until high school, and even then, it was not by any means the majority of my schoolwork that was done on a computer. So, our experience of learning to read from books and having books among our other choices of entertainment is unique. Is for people a few years younger than us is no longer the default experience, which spins my head a little bit. They're my favorite things. They have all the obvious benefits of books, and perhaps most importantly, I feel like they teach you to self-teach in a way that's sitting before audio video material that just is conveying information to you. With a book, you are extracting the information for yourself. When I was in high school calculus, we had this tough cookie teacher, and he had taught us differentiation, and then he sent us home with certain homework, and then we all turned to the page and saw that it was about integration, which is just the converse, just doing differentiation backwards. And most of my classmates came back the next day and said, Mr. Trem, you gave us the wrong homework. We didn't learn that yet. And I was one of a few who had read the material, done the integration homework, and brought it back. I was not the only one, but I was one of the few. And I really credit him. He taught me an invaluable lesson for college, which is that you actually can sit down with a math textbook and extract information from it and put it into your brain. For most of us, they were just bricks we carried around, and all of the information came from the math teacher. But he taught me that it sounds obvious, but I don't know if you've ever had a similar experience. That was the first time I was like, oh, even this very technical information that I've always had fed to me, actually, I can get out of this tome I've been carrying around all these years.
I love that story because I have a very similar one actually. So when in college I majored in computer engineering, which is a mix of software and hardware, and it was primarily because I was so confident that I could do hardware even though I had no experience in it. And so I go to college, and my first semester there, I realize I have no instincts in this thing, in electronics, analog electronics, digital. I know nothing about those fields. And so I remember going to the library on campus, and again taking a tome of a textbook, and sitting at the same desk, which overlooked the some English countryside, and just reading the same line over and over again for a whole week.
Right, a boy.
Until I finally understood what the combination of words meant, until I had a concept that I could internalize. And it took forever, but eventually I was able to make it through the chapter, and then the second chapter became easier, and so on. So I hear what you say about with a book you can control the pace. You can it doesn't. I mean, it could be passive, I guess, just like a video is, but I feel it's easier for it to not be passive because you're exerting an effort to get that stuff into your brain.
Certainly more of an effort, I would argue. Certainly more of an effort. It's interesting too. I personally tend to distinguish between two different sort of reading experiences. Where, and honestly, I wish I read more books today than even I have fallen off a little bit. Probably it's because I go home with screen fatigue. But I'm just gonna be a dork. I really like the Dresden Files, Jim Butcher. This is a sci-fi series, urban sci-fi series. And you can just sit, open one up. It's like you're in a movie. It's great. Your eyes just follow. You can see it all happening in your mind's eye. There's monsters and things. But then there's also books where when I have more wherewithal, it's a much more active reading experience because you really have to parse what character is this again? Or, oh, this is, Victorian English, but what are they saying here in essence? Like, how would I be saying this in the modern day? And where you have to do a much more active, you have to have your concentration turned on. You can't just run your eyes down the end of every paragraph, expect to have understood it. So I have to see what I'm in the mood for on any given day. It's like, is this high engagement reading day, or is this a sci-fi book reclining reading day? You know what I mean?
Yeah, there are books. Russian literature is that for me. I lose track of who's who. And I've only done it a few times in my life. And when I do it, I have to spend ages on each page just because sometimes the same character has a different name and you have to create an outline.
Right.
Just to kind of follow the story. And I don't do it as often, I think, because it requires much more of an effort. And so I prefer books that don't require an effort, that I can watch the same way I might watch something, or that I can read the same way I might watch something online.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's trade-offs.
I mean, no one can be, not to say pretentious, no one can be on all the time. We get to enjoy reading.
That's true.
Although I must add that the book I've often cited as my favorite book is The God of Small Things, which is by Arundhati Roy. And I think if I had not first encountered it in high school with a wonderful teacher, who got us all set up with a diagram of the family tree and walked us through chapter by chapter what the heck was happening, because it's this multi-generational narrative of family trauma in India. I don't think it ever would have been my favorite book if I hadn't had that hand-holding on the first read. And yet, it's so enriching to revisit it now. So shout out to book clubs and high school English classes and places like that where we can support each other through the hard ones, basically.
Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, I've never been part of a book club, but it feels like that's a good place to go to see how other people interpreted the same thing that you read. And then sometimes you don't get all the images, but somebody else describing a chapter all of a sudden paints that image in your mind. So that's helpful. So The God of Small Things, you said that's what it's called?
The God of Small Things, very interesting, a very interesting fiction book where Arundhati, I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation of her name, Arundhati Roy, the author, she has this almost poetry adjacent use of language with miscellaneous caps and abundant sentence fragments, interesting intentional misspellings. This all sounds off-putting, but it's incredibly artful the way she does it. I had a pet theory, which I think I put in a high school essay at the time, that the some of the words that were miscellaneously capped were actually the small things, which were quite big things, the things which loomed quite large in memory, even though it was often the stuff of childhood. A lot of the traumatic events of the narrative are perceived through the eyes of the protagonist as a child, although you also meet her as an adult, as it's all told out of order. Yes.
Interesting. All right, maybe two more questions, Karen, and then I'll let you go. One question is off the back of the sci-fi book you mentioned. Are there TV shows that you watch that you enjoy?
Some of the recent ones that have really got me going, Black Mirror. I'd be curious if you had taken in any of that.
Yeah, for sure. Charlie Booker, right? Is that his name? Or Brooker?
I'm such a dunce about knowing the people involved in making the media that I like, which is really shameful.
I think he's because I know him from his work in England. So I think he wrote it and was involved in the American version of it. But yeah, that one is dystopian and not always easy to watch.
Did you watch it all?
No?
Um, it's really interesting how the tenor changes from episode to episode. And I always tell people that I watched the first 3 episodes, and even though I was pretty compelled by each of them as they were happening, I almost bailed because it was too much. It was too stressful. Some of it was too visceral. And then I can't remember if it was the 4th episode, but there are a few that are just dry or just suspenseful. There's one that's funny. So it varies. It actually varies. A lot of it is dystopian. I mean, it's all dystopian in some sense, but it's not all apocalyptically dystopian. Sometimes it's wry commentary on the human social condition, dystopian. um, yeah, it's a great series. Just true sci-fi. True, what if we keep going the way we're going and arrive at the worst possible place? What would that be like? Sci-fi, the essence of sci-fi. Yeah, so
Nice.
that was the first one that sprang to mind.
Nice. All right. So last question, Karen. Again, thanks for your time today. So when I was in Spain a year or two ago, the thing that I noticed when I went to the bookshops is that they were full of teenagers, and I'd never seen that before. At least here, like they were kind of full of teenagers buying books, hanging out, and it got me thinking. As you work with the international presses, are you seeing trends in different markets, be it with readership, be it with demographics, be it with things that or fields that they like more so than in the U.S.? Are there just general patterns that you've noticed in other markets?
I do seem to see more and more applications of the graphic format in and beyond YA, in not just manga and not just fiction, but also nonfiction, history, science. That sprang to my mind because I see, on occasion, I'll get an email from an agent to foreign publishers or from foreign publishers themselves. This is what we're publishing here. Maybe this will interest you to consider a US edition. And impressionistically, it seems to me that I see more graphic novel-esque books across genres arriving before me in those sorts of emails. I hesitate to make any statistical generalization from that because it is very limited. But we talk about it amongst ourselves here too. It seems to be on the ascent, the expansion of the graphic treatment
Nice.
across genres and ages. Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Well, Karen, again thank you for your time.
Oh, it's my internet debut. Usually I'm just behind the scenes. But this has been a pleasure. I would talk about books with you indefinitely. And it's good to see you, Ali, and I'll be sure not to preemptively close the window.
Thanks, Karen. Take care then.